Evening. Tonight you'll be seeing Pope Francis, man of his word, and the director, Wim Wenders, will be talking with us about this wonderful film. I could wax eloquent about Mr. Wenders' films for hours at a time because he's been my favorite director since I first discovered his work over 40 years ago. Fortunately, for your sake, it's my job to introduce Father John, who insists on very brief introductions. When I asked for help from his staff regarding my introduction, they suggested something like, I give you Father John Jenkins, 17th President of the University of Notre Dame, and then go sit down. I'll try to abide by that advice, but I insist on making one incredibly important point. This evening's program is a showcase event in this year's forum, but it is also testimony to Father John's support for the arts at this university. I have been teaching at Notre Dame for over 30 years, and I can say with absolute certainty that the arts have never been so central to the mission of this university. We have been able to achieve many great things over the past few years, but none of them would have been possible without Father John's conviction that the arts are a way of knowing about our experience and our spiritual life. This, for me, is what makes tonight such a signature event. We have a visionary president and a visionary filmmaker whose films are very elegant arguments for what the arts can teach us about living a meaningful life. That being said, it is my great pleasure to give you Father John Jenkins, 17th President of the University of Notre Dame.
Welcome, everyone, and I want to thank Jim for that extremely kind introduction. The topic of the forum is a reflection of some of what Jim said about the connection between our Catholic mission and the arts. I mean, they are so intimately connected, and that's really what we want to explore, how the arts and faith can we can find insight through that connection. That's why we're so delighted and privileged to welcome Wim Wenders tonight. Introducing Wim as a challenge because he's more than a renowned filmmaker. He's a great artist who is informed by the experience to include family, faith, and an artist's insatiable curiosity for life. He's a true polymath. As a young man, Wim studied medicine in Munich, philosophy in Freiburg, sociology in Dusseldorf. He is a painter whose movies are influenced by the 18th century landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich and the barren 20th century cityscapes of Edward Hopper. One might mistake Wim as American because of his love for the American songbook, aptly illustrated in his movie, The $1 Million Hotel. He also directed the music video for U2's cover of Cole Porter's Night and Day. Wim won the British Oscar and the Palme d'Or at Cannes for the movie Paris, Texas. He won Best Director at Cannes for Wings of Desire. He was nominated for an Academy Award 3 times for 3 documentaries, Buena Vista Social Club, Pina, and The Salt of the Earth, in which he beautifully explored Cuban music, dance, and the life of the Brazilian photographer. He is a photographer himself. He was awarded honorary doctorates at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1989. He has an honorary doctorate in theology from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland in 1995 and the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium in 2005. Raised a Catholic, Wim has shared that he experienced alienation from the church in the late 1960s, only to be drawn back to the Christian faith when his father was near death. Wim, in an interview, recalled, quote, seeing him face death without fear, and actually with some anticipation and joy, was an incredible experience, unquote. Wim, we cannot thank you enough for making the trip from your home in Germany to be with us. You honor us with your presence. Wim will have an interview afterwards, but I'm going to introduce him now to say a few words to introduce the film. Wim Wenders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Father John. He left me alone. I'm happy to see all of you, or actually not see all of you, because the light in my face. I'm happy you're here to see a man of his word. I'm also happy that we actually call the film this way. Like many films, while we are preparing it and then shooting it, and you know, with the crew you have to call it something, so it was always the Pope film. Until we realized that was not a title. And then I frantically started to look for a title. I know somebody suggested Close Encounters with the Pope. And while I was editing one scene of the film, actually you'll see it's the only film in English. It's the only scene in English. It's at the American Senate when Pope Francis spoke in front of the two houses. And I had a discussion with my editor about that the Pope didn't have any political power, no military power, that he only had his word. And I said, wow, wait a minute. That is the title. Man of his word. So I found that in America. I thank you for it. And I thank you for watching the film. Now I'll be here to talk with several other people, but also hopefully with you. And I'll be seeing you then. Take good care.
Okay, I'd like to begin by explaining what we have in mind, which is that the members of the panel will each put one question to Mr. Wenders, and then we will go to questions from the audience, and there are microphones at the end of each aisle. Professor Cummings, would you start us off, please?
Thank you. My name is Kathleen Cummings. I teach American Studies and History here at Notre Dame, and I also direct the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, which means I talk a lot about Pope Francis. And Wim, I just want to thank you. So many people know about Pope Francis only through sound bites, these clips that we have heard in the media. And so I want to thank you for your more intimate portrait and helping us all get to know him much better. I wanted to ask you about the decision to frame it in terms of, to weave St. Francis of Assisi into the narrative and that footage. If you could talk about that process a bit.
The night, or maybe it was day in America, I don't know, when probably lots of us watched on television that there was a new pope, I was sitting in front of my TV as well, and for once in my life, 9 years of Latin paid off. Because before we ever saw the Pope, there was a diacon coming up and saying in Latin that the new Pope was called Bergoglium something, that I couldn't really follow, but that he had chosen the name of Franciscus in Latin. And that was before I ever laid eyes on Pope Francis, and I was excited. I thought, wow, whoever is going to show up now, he's got to have guts to call himself Francis in the 21st century. Because raised as a Catholic boy, the only saint I knew something about was St. Francis. That was the guy who spoke to the birds, which I tried. But I knew everything about him because he was a big hero of my childhood, and I knew that no pope had ever picked up on that name. So I was excited, and I loved the man before he even showed up. And I figured, as not everybody is raised Catholic, people should know about what that meant, that choice of name.
My name's Laura. I'm a film, television, and theater major here at the university. I'm getting my concentration in film and a minor in European studies. And my question for you, Mr. Wenders, is kind of about the timeliness of your work. that you have films like Alice in the Cities and Paris, Texas that are timeless. And you have Wings of Desire that is very much situated as a review of Germany's past and yet kind of predicted German reunification. How do you see this film affecting the past, the present, and the future, and do you feel you have any influence on that as a director?
Sometimes it only dawns on you when you're making a film what you're doing. And I was very excited on having a chance to be face to face with Pope Francis. I didn't really actively try to make this film. I was asked by the Office of Communication at the Vatican if I'd be willing to discuss the project. So they actually asked me, and when it done, I went there, of course, because that was quite amazing to get mail from the Vatican. I had not opened it. I had it in my hand. I thought, wow, what did I do wrong? So, and then it was an invitation to come and discuss the film. So I went there. It turned out that the man in charge of this Office of Communication was a film buff, and Monsignore Vigano, who had nothing to do with the bishop of the same name. He, please note, and he said, well, Pope is communicating in different ways, and one of the things we thought was maybe that a film could be a way for him to communicate. And then I asked him, well, to how many people did you send that letter? And he said, I only sent it to you. I was a little bit scared then. And that's really my answer. Well, we took on the film, and I was told that I could have complete artistic freedom, and it would not be financed by the Vatican, but independently. So, and I was very excited, and I started to write, and then it dawned on me while I was writing it, wait a minute, this is not so easy. And then when we shot the film, and when I was editing, I realized that was a different kind of responsibility than any other film I'd ever made. I mean, you can make a film about some old man in Havana, and you have a certain responsibility for their life. And if they become the Beatles, well, I had something to do with it, but this was very different. And I realized, wow. And I had started to have sleepless nights because I couldn't really share this responsibility with anybody, because at the Vatican, in the office, and nobody else knew in the Vatican about the film except the Office of Communication. We made the film completely under the radar. So I had nobody to turn to. And I realized that was a different film from anything I'd ever done before. So, and at one night, my wife woke up because she realized I wasn't sleeping, and she said, "What is it?" I said, I don't know. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. This is not a movie. It's something else. And she said, don't worry. You rehearsed 50 years for this. That might sound like a way to put me back to sleep, but it was a good answer. And ever since I think of the film as that. I rehearsed long enough for it. Did I answer your question?
Sure.
Yeah.
My name is Susanna Cunningham. I'm a PhD candidate in history here at Notre Dame. And my question is about following up on some of what you just were talking about, but it's about access and representation. Can you comment on how unusual this is for a filmmaker to have such unprecedented access to Pope Francis, but also the Vatican more generally? And also what limitations a filmmaker might encounter given such intimacy with the subject of the film?
Well, the first limitation was in my very first concept. I said, this is going to be a film not about Pope Francis, this should be a film with Pope Francis. And as he is a man who's trying to tell the world that we could all try to get by with less, I'm not going to make an expensive film. So that was my first part of the first concept was cinema povere, which means a poor film. So that was a limitation, because we really, and that meant, for instance, that I wouldn't go on each of the journeys, but because there was hundreds of film crews traveling wherever Pope Francis was traveling, so, and I didn't want to add another film crew. So we said we're going to live, as far as documentary footage is concerned, we're going to live with everything that exists. Vatican TV had their own film crew to go wherever he was. And then there was, when he was in America, it was covered by 20 TV stations. And so that, and everywhere he was, there was so much. So part of the concept was to use found footage for his journeys. And the other limitation was, well, budget. We tried to make a very small film. And I didn't want this to be interviews with the Pope. So I figured that if I had this unbelievable chance to sit face to face with Pope Francis, and as I knew a little bit about his attitude, about his writings and his philosophy, so I knew it was a lot about closeness. So I figured if I was going to be able and be granted that closeness, that was exactly what I would like to pass on to the audience. So I didn't want the two of us to sit there and have an interview, but I wanted, and him looking into my eyes, I wanted to share that with the audience. And that was in a way a limitation, because it meant that I had to give up that being opposite of it. We shot it in the end with something as simple as a teleprompter. But he, of course, he didn't have his lines. But he saw, on the teleprompter, he saw my face. It's called, it's a system invented by Errol Morris, an American documentary maker. It basically is an adapted teleprompter. So the person you're interviewing sees you on a monitor. Not a monitor, it's a transparent glass. He sees you on that, and by looking you in the eye, he looks straight into the lens. So when Pope Francis first came to the set, he saw that right away. He asked me, "Wait a minute, where are you sitting?" Because he realized there was a big camera and something in front of it, and there was his chair. So I explained the whole setup to him, and I said, "You're going to see me here, and where are you sitting?" He interrupted me. So I showed him behind the camera. There was the whole thing in reverse. I was sitting there with the camera in front of me, and the same kind of mirror. And then he liked the idea. So that was a limitation that I had to give up to be physically face to face, although he saw nothing else than my face on his little screen, and I saw nothing else than his face. But it was a little limitation, because the personal touch, I had to give that up in order for you to have that.
What?
So my name is Will. I'm a senior here studying international economics in German. And one of the things that struck me most about the film was how it portrayed Francis as a figure who's both admired and adored by people from all walks of life, whether they be Catholics or non-believers. And so my question for you, Mr. Wenders, is how did you approach making a film that would be equally appealing to people on both sides of the aisle, especially given today's increasingly divisive political and social climate? And in particular, how did you approach creating a film that would both acknowledge the controversies surrounding the church and the papacy, and yet at the same time offer a hopeful portrayal of Francis as the correct leader for the church in the 21st century?
Well, I knew when we started the film that in the Catholic Church he was controversial. and that he did have enemies. And I figured that the fact that we shot the film under the radar had a little bit to do with that. And one of the very specific questions I asked in that first meeting when they said, would you consider a film? I said, what is it you have in mind? Is it a film for Catholics or for Christians or for everybody? And they said, oh, please, certainly for everybody, because Pope Francis is trying to address people all over the world, and so you don't feel that you have to make a Catholic film, so to speak. So I knew that I was free to think of a film that would cover a whole range of subjects. I got involved in his speeches and the themes that are important to him. And already in the course of the editing, I realized that the closeness that he's able to create, and that is part of his message and is part of his unique talent, is to be close to people, and that it translates sort of well, and that a lot of my friends who I showed the films, because I don't do previews or anything, but every now and then I asked one of my friends if they could see the film, and there were some hardcore atheists who I really had to twist their arms to come see a film about Pope Francis. And I saw them cry. And I realized we were onto something. And it does translate past the boundaries, so to speak, of religion. So that was important, I think, for me, because it enabled to show lots of facets of his character, as well as his entire approach and the freedom he takes, I think, and the courage he has, because that's the most important thing I realized while we were talking for 8 hours, 4 times 2 hours. I realized, and you feel that in a person, I realized that he was fearless. And that is an amazing quality. I had never seen that in a man that I had encountered so closely, that quality of being completely fearless. And I felt that translated in the film, and I think it was important. And so the film is really, hopefully, for all audiences, although I do think that all over the world, Catholics are more attracted to come see it, and a lot of people sort of have to overcome the hurdle to have that it's a film with a pope. A lot of people see that as a drawback. Little do they know.
Before you came, I asked my colleagues and other people at the university who I know are Wenders fans what their favorite Wenders film was. And I got a range of answers from Paris, Texas, to Wings of Desire, to Pina, to Salt of the Earth. And then I read in an interview that when you were asked, what's your favorite film, your favorite Wenders film, you said it was Pope Francis. Could you say a little bit about that? Why is this your favorite film?
Luckily, never ever before I answered that question with my last film. So I have a track record of not saying my last film, because otherwise it would have been a little bit fishy. This is insofar true as the way it took us from when I got the letter from December 13 until this year, April, so it's almost 5 years, 4.5 years. It took us a long time, and I spent a long time on it, and it became less and less a movie and more part of my life and part of, I don't know, a film is sort of a job sometimes, and this was no longer a job after a while. It was something that was strangely necessary to do, and that, as my wife said, I rehearsed long enough for it, and I realized slowly that it was a different responsibility, and it was more than a film for me. And maybe that's why I said this film, I like it more than others, because, I don't know, there's more in it than I ever put into a film before.
That's a wonderful answer. Okay, I think we could open it up to questions from the audience.
If
we
we
need
see
to
them.
bring up the lights a little bit, perhaps, and their microphones are at either end of the aisle.
Hey, there's people up there. There's even people waving. Maybe they want to have a microphone. No.
Please, go ahead.
Hi. I was simply curious about, when it comes to making films of a more documentary nature, do you have any practices to prevent any of your own preconceptions or biases from affecting the final product?
Well, preconceptions are something extremely dangerous in filmmaking, even if you tell a story, and even if you have a script. When I was a younger filmmaker, I needed preconceptions, and I did try to imagine the film before, and that became more and more of a dead end, and then I realized it was much better to be more adventurous and see the making of the film like an experience I have to go through myself, and only if I make a new experience, then it can be an experience for somebody else. So I try to refrain from preconceptions. In this case, well, it was really make a film that doesn't cost much. I knew I was going to somehow show a little bit of the life of St. Francis. I didn't know we had to shoot it ourselves. I figured I was going to find some footage that showed the life of St. Francis, and I looked at all the films that existed ever since the silent era. There is quite a number of films on the life of St. Francis, but in the end I realized I couldn't quote any of them. The last one was Mickey Rourke playing St. Francis. And it was not so bad. It was Liliana Cavani. But St. Francis was full of tattoos. That didn't fly so well.
No, it doesn't seem like the right
So
accessory.
I realized I had to shoot that myself. So even that was not preconceived, because I thought we could find some footage. So, and then I sort of realized I had shot myself in the foot by saying I want to make a film that doesn't cost any, because St. Francis lived in the 13th century. So somehow we had to shoot some historical footage without money. So I realized then the only way to do that was a dirty trick. We shot it with an old hand cranker from the 1920s on actual film, like Buster Keaton. And that camera makes everything look very old. So if you really look, you see cars in the background and antennas on the houses. But the old hand cranker just makes everything invisible. It feels old. So even that wasn't preconceived. And finding out how to talk to Pope Francis was an idea. It slowly dawned on me that I wanted him to look at you, not at me. And then we found so much footage. We had 800 hours to go through all his journeys and stuff. That took months to actually only watch it and then subtitle it and find the essentials. So I can say that I didn't try to imagine the film before, and I found it as we were shooting it and editing it. And my good advice to any filmmaker is stay away from preconceptions.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
What is are your wishes that you would like for us to all take away from viewing your documentary?
My hope is that some of the courage and positive energy and deep belief of Pope Francis rubs off, and that being eye to eye with him somehow gets to you. That's the shortest answer I ever gave. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this screening. I was particularly moved by how you said you want this film to be a film of poverty too. And as aspiring video maker in this world, and I'm very curious about what do you think are the poverty that's in need to be lived out in the filmmaking industry in this age. You talked a little bit about how you personally kind of embodied it in the process of making this film, but I'm curious in general, as an industry, what are your comments on it, and how do you suggest we address it? Thank you.
Well, normally, you do need money to make a movie. But I've also been teaching, and we actually made movies on iPhones because we didn't have much money in the school. And in the course of my own experience, I also found out that money was not the solution for most of the movies I was involved in. And I've seen it also with friends. If you have too much money, it's a curse. Actually, no movie was ever made that was any good that had all the money it needed. If you don't have enough, that is a blessing, because you have to somehow substitute the lack of financial resources with imagination. And that can only improve the film. So I probably talked myself out of my next budget here. And I think a lot of movies being made today cost a scandalous amount of money. Scandalous. And most of them would probably be better if they had less. But that isn't even the question anymore. I think most of it is almost indecent. And I forgot the drift of your question, but did I somehow meet it?
May I ask a really quick kind of sister
Sure.
question of that? I'm curious, you definitely addressed really well the financial poverty part of it, but I personally struggle with somehow, especially documentary filmmakers, being caught so many times that a film is your film and it's my film. And I guess I want to hear about this kind of poverty of spirit as a filmmaker, as you experience it. Yeah.
That is the better question. The money question is sort of...
No, I didn't ask.
I know, but the second half of the question is the crucial one. And how do you make it yours? And especially if you don't have any means, when is it yours and how is it yours? And there is something essential about the act of making a film or putting up the camera and filming something and deciding on the angle and deciding where to cut and deciding where to shoot it and deciding the whole soul of the film. Somehow you have an idea in the very beginning and that makes you to want to make the film. And very often a film is something that gets lost in the process because you have this flame in the beginning burning in you and then it goes through so many hands and you have to fight so much for it that before you know it, that candle is out and that is a disaster and that is very painful. So the art of it, the whole thing is that you can keep it burning even if it's a little flame, and that you know throughout the process that it is yours. And so you have to be in touch with that initial reason and that initial seed that was born at some time. And you have to know from the beginning that it's going to carry you. And then nothing can happen to it, even if you don't have enough means, and even if you have to make compromises. None of that matters if you know that's what you wanted in the beginning, and if you know that nobody else could have done it except you. And that is easy to say, and maybe not so easy to live, but you can live it if you just stick to it, and if you just, with each decision, hang on to your own flame. Because it's unfortunately true that a lot of films being made today could be made by somebody else. But you have to make sure that nobody else could have made it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For me personally, a couple of very powerful moments in the film involved the children. There was the two girls who asked the question, one of which was, why did you become a pope? Why did you want to become pope? And the other one was where I thought the little boy turned the page back so that I think it was his picture that could be acknowledged properly by the Pope.
Yeah, he saw the Pope leaf over it and wanted to leave.
So as a storyteller, I imagine, maybe I'm wrong, but I imagine that you recognize those as powerful symbolic moments and with an emotional impact that is worth thinking about strategically about where you would place them in the film. So I imagine, not being a filmmaker myself, but I imagine that you thought carefully about, okay, where should I put these moments with the children, because they say so much about Pope Francis and about Saint Francis. How did you decide where to put them in the film? At which point in the film?
Yeah. That process is basically called editing. And that is a stupid answer but it's just to begin that you have to make choices. And I had 55 questions that Pope Francis answered. Already that was way too much. We had 8 hours of film of that, him looking into the camera. And the film is 90 minutes and half of it is our interviews, so that is, how much is it? 10% or 15% of the actual amount of time we shot. Then we had 800 hours of the footage from all over the world and 3 or 4 hours of the story of St. Francis. And there was good moments in all of it, especially in the documentary footage, because that was a gift. I mean, I didn't shoot any of it, and I saw all of this, and the children are certainly a great gift that I recognized when I saw it for the first time. I said, oh wow, look at that. But the whole thing about editing is that the film can completely fail if you put everything in it that you like. And if you put everything in it that you like, it might not be emotional anymore for anybody else. So those moments with the children were precious, and some of the things that Pope Francis said were precious, and some of the simple things he said were more precious than some of the heavy-duty things he said. Like when he said, for instance, he got sidetracked because he answered some of the questions at length, and then he got sidetracked himself, and out of a sudden he was talking about the time when he was taking confession. I was getting a little desperate because I wanted to get to my next question, and then started about talking to young couples when they would come in, and he would ask them questions, and I didn't think it had anything to do with the film. And then he said out of a sudden, so I asked these people, mother and father, a question, and I asked them, do you play with your children? And I thought I didn't believe my ears, because I felt the whole film I was making in a nutshell. That little innocent question, do you play with your children, was more about our times and the history where we stand today than a lot of the big social subjects. The question, do you still play with your children, that is more the crux of humanity today than almost anything else. So out of a sudden, something that was apparently very small was giant and big. And the same with the moments with the kids, and there were others. And in editing, and that's the thing, the biggest rule is that you have to kill your darlings. So there are other moments with kids that are not in the film. There's a few others that I'm still having. I wake up at night and said, why didn't you use it? But that's it. That's what editing is called. To kill some of your darlings, because so that the other ones can shine.
Can I ask a question from back here?
Sure.
My question is, this film deserves to be seen by lots of people. That would be my premise. What are your plans for distribution for the film, and how are you going to get it out to people?
Well, it is theoretically shown all over the world. It was distributed in the US from late May for 2 months. I don't know whether it ever came here.
It did.
It did?
That's where I saw it.
So it got seen by a large audience in America. I was very, very, very disappointed not so long ago when I found out that the distributor are not making an effort to show it in South America. I couldn't believe it. And then they explained to me that the situation with theaters and documenters is just that they couldn't do it. So I was really extremely sad about this, because in my mind that's where the film should have been shown first. But it wasn't shown there. It's not shown in Africa. It's shown all over Europe, yeah. So what do? I mean, I can't travel myself all over the world. So I try my best. We tried our best to make the distributors believe in the fact that it was a film that concerned a lot of people, and that actually the feedback every now and then is everybody should see it. I know that, but try to explain that to a distributor. Everybody should see it, and they laugh at you. This is not Star Wars. Then again, it is. So, you're totally right. It's the rules of cinema, commercial cinema today are pretty cruel. And a lot of films don't get the attention they should get, and a lot of films are gone before you know it, and it's a lot of competition for attention. And so I'm happy the film is at least shown all over Europe and in America, and with mixed results. In some countries it does work, in some other countries only very few people come to see it. It is really a film that I hope will stay for a while, and even when you can buy it on DVD or when it's on video on demand or so, that other people who missed it or who missed that it was shown theatrically can have a chance to see it. I think it, more than others, it depends a little bit on a word of mouth and from people telling each other about it. But it's out there, and that is a commercial interest, theatrical distribution and DVDs and streaming. It's all part of a world that doesn't think in terms of what the film is about, but strictly in terms of revenues. So we tried our best, and I think that the people who see it are happy that it exists, and a lot of people think, why should I watch a movie with the Pope? Unfortunately. At least some of my best friends. When I asked them, did you see it? No. And when I insist on asking, well, you see, film about the Pope, there's other things to do in life. So you have to overcome a certain hurdle. Maybe not here. But thank you for the question.
Do you have another question over there? I can't.
So Pope Francis talked about change and how it's required for us to grow. In your experience with doing this particular film versus the other films that you've done, how do you think that this has changed you or made you grow as a filmmaker or as a Christian or as a person?
You just cannot spend 4 years on a project like this and for 2 years being face to face with this man on a daily basis in the editing room. I know everything he says in the film by heart, strictly because I've heard it so often, several hundred times, I think. So you can't help it, it'll get to you. And especially the qualities that really, I read his encyclicals and I saw a lot of footage on television, so I had a feeling I know him a little bit before I ever met him. And then I was really completely overwhelmed by that capacity to create closeness and to communicate, and that sheer endless positive energy and this fearlessness. So it does rub off on you, and you realize, wow, what am I afraid of? Don't have to be afraid of anything. He's a great example for that. Thank you.
I think we have time.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much, Mr. Wenders, for being here. It was an incredible film. I promise I didn't have this question thought about before I watched the movie, or watching the film, but it made me so passionate I had to type it up while I was back there.
Sure.
I want to live in a world that Pope Francis talks about. As a Catholic, I am torn as I align with what Francis says, but not what Catholics I know and live around believe. Why, in your opinion, is there a disconnect between what Pope Francis says and how a majority of American Catholics act? An election just happened, and the majority of Catholics, for example, in 2016, 52% voted for Trump and 45% voted for Clinton, according to Pew Research. Why do Catholics vote to put people in power who abuse the earth, deny there is a problem, hate on immigrants and migrants, and want to build walls, which is not what Pope Francis talks about in this movie? In your opinion, why is there a disconnect?
That is a damn good question. If I knew, I would put it in action. I very much hope that those 52% didn't vote for him again, because I think in the first 2 years they should have learned that this is not at all Christian, what he's representing, in no way. That is actually the opposite, in many ways. But I don't want this to be too political, but I don't know sometimes why politics are a very treacherous ground, because the lack of morality is scary. The lack of morality, not just here, but in Europe, in China, in Russia. The way politics are happening is as if morality had never been a topic of mankind. Politics today are deeply amoral, scarily amoral, and that's why I was happy to be making this film the last 4 years, because there was a countermodel. There was a person with a moral compass. And then you go out in the world and that compass is lost. It's completely gone. And I don't know why Catholics, or I don't know why anybody would vote for that kind of politics that is so clearly not for the best of humanity. And I'm happy that Pope Francis so often speaks about the common good. And I was very happy to edit the scene in front of the Congress. Actually, it was the two houses. It was happy that he said, well, all of us are basically immigrants, so. Which we are. I mean, look around. Everybody I met today was second generation from somewhere else, or first. So I think it's scary, and in Europe it's the same phenomenon. Trump is not alone. In Europe, most leaders today gain majorities because they say, close the bloody border. Don't let them in. They are the enemy. They want to invade us. My country, that was a huge example, or a huge exception of the rule, let in 1.5 million immigrants a couple of years ago. Mrs. Merkel is falling over this. That was something she did from the heart, and I was very, very proud of my country for once in my life. And now we're surrounded. We're the European country with more borders than anybody else. We have 9 borders with 9 countries. 7 of them are now nationalist. So, America only has 2 borders. Still, I think it's scary if you realize, I don't know what people are thinking. I don't know why they vote for those who are not acting on their behalf. I don't know, it escapes me. Thank you for your question, but it's...
Thank you very much.
If I knew a better answer, boy, would we do something. Thank you.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Mr. Wenders has a flight to catch yet tonight. I want to, we do have a gift for him, though, that Susanna is going to present to him.
Really? Wow.
That's Father Hesburgh and Martin Luther King.
Oh, that is so sweet. I've seen this picture before, but this is much nicer to have it. Thank you. Thank you, Father John. Wow, you don't know how much that means to me. Thank you, Father John, for signing it to me, and thank you for the idea.
And thank you so much for coming. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.